Henry VIII's Chin by Author Unknown. This is recorded to celebrate the 8th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Henry VIII's Chin. Shakespeare's play of Henry VIII opens with a conversation between the Dukes of Buckingham and Norfolk about the glories of the celebrated Field of the Cloth of Gold, and surely the sight must have been worth seeing which could have so far outshone the ordinary pageantry of such a time as to become famous forever in the annals of two kingdoms. What was meant by the brilliant show? In the same conversation, admiration of the pageant itself soon gives place to disgust at Cardinal Wolsey as its author. We hear that the alliance celebrated with all this gorgeous display had already burst like a bubble. "For France hath flawed the league and hath attached our merchants' goods at Bordeaux." Truly it was a very hollow affair, seen through, perfectly well understood on both sides to be hollow. But we must add one comment in the interest of historic justice. The perfidy which brought about the rupture so soon after these grand demonstrations of amity was not on the side of France. Henry VIII. Was, at the time of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, much younger than we usually see him in portraits or read of him in history. As yet he had not quite acquired all that fullness of body with which Holbein has made us familiar. Thought of divorce had not yet occupied him. Tall, strong, and muscular, he took part in all manly exercises, and excelled in all. "His Majesty," says the Venetian ambassador Justinian, in a despatch intended only for the eyes of his court, "is 29 years old and extremely handsome. Nature could not have done more for him. He is much handsomer than any other sovereign in Christendom, a great deal handsomer than the King of France, very fair, and his whole frame admirably proportioned." On hearing that Francis I. wore a beard, he allowed his own to grow, and as it is reddish, he has now got a beard that looks like gold. He is very accomplished, a good musician, composes well, is a most capital horseman, a fine jouster, speaks good French, Latin, and Spanish, is very religious, hears 3 masses daily when he hunts, and sometimes 5 on other days. He hears the office every day in the Queen's chamber, that is to say, vesper and compline. He is very fond of hunting, and never takes his diversion without tiring 8 or 10 horses, which he causes to be stationed beforehand along the line of country he means to take, and when one is tired he mounts another, and before he gets home they are all exhausted. He is extremely fond of tennis, at which game it is the prettiest thing in the world to see him play, his fair skin glowing through a shirt of the finest texture." And in perfect accordance with this is the testimony of another Venetian, Pasqualigo, a year or 2 earlier. "His Majesty is the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg, his complexion very fair and bright, with auburn hair combed straight and short in the French fashion, and a round face, so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman, his throat being rather long and thick." A muscular frame, good animal spirits, and general good humor. Who is not captivated by such qualities? And though Henry had kingly dignity too, which not the very boldest would have ventured for a moment to slight, he had yet a familiarity and condescension at times which would have scorned the restraints of a cold and lifeless etiquette. In a household book of the Earl of Devon, we find an entry which brings these characteristics out in strong relief, where, among a multitude of other petty payments, is the following: "To a lad at Charlton, for lending his cap to my lord when the king and his lords threw snowballs, 4d." But though Henry was no slave to etiquette, there were fashions in that day as in this, and it would seem that in that day as in this the fashions came from France. Not only was it "on hearing that Francis I. wore a beard" that Henry allowed his own to grow, but, as we have seen above, Pasqualigo found that he combed his hair "straight and short in the French fashion." Pasqualigo also reported of him as follows: "He speaks French, English, and Latin, and a little Italian, plays well on the lute and harpsichord, sings from book at sight, draws the bow with greater strength than any man in England, and jousts marvellously." The day after this was written happened to be May Day, and the ambassador was called at an early hour to see the king go a Maying. He found the king's bodyguard dressed all in green, like foresters, with bows and arrows, and Henry himself wore a suit entirely of the same color. Even his shoes were green. Breakfast was served in the bowers of Greenwich Park, and Pasqualigo had a further interview with Henry, which he describes as follows: "His Majesty came into our arbor, and addressing me in French, said, 'Talk with me a while. The King of France, is he as tall as I am?' I told him there was but little difference. He continued, 'Is he as stout?' I said he was not, and he then inquired, 'What sort of legs has he?' I replied, 'Spare,' whereupon he opened the front of his doublet, and placing his hand on his thigh, said, 'Look here, and I have also a good calf to my leg.' He then told me that he was very fond of this King of France, and that on more than 3 occasions he was very near him with his army, but that he would never allow himself to be seen, and always retreated, which his Majesty attributed to deference for King Louis, who did not choose an engagement to take place." Francis I., of whom this was said, had ascended the French throne only 4 months previously, a young and dashing king, in whom men looked for a revival of something of the old spirit of chivalry. Henry evidently regarded him as a rival, whom he was anxious to outdo, mind, body, and legs, in the eyes of the world, and this thought must have been frequently in his mind during the negotiations for the grand interview between them, which had begun to be talked about almost as soon as Francis became king. The proposal for it, indeed, seems originally to have come from Francis, but it met with the most cordial response from Henry, who, there can be little doubt, was anxious, not only to see his rival, but to exhibit his own magnificence and personal accomplishments before his rival's subjects, to show heads and legs with Francis before France itself. For 2 or 3 years, however, the project cooled. Francis, at the beginning of his reign, set off on an Italian expedition, which did not please Henry, and the relations between them were not altogether cordial. But the clouds seem to have dispersed when, at the end of 3 years, a treaty was made, which was supposed to rivet firmly the alliance of the two kings, by a project of marriage between the Dauphin and the infant Princess Mary. Then the place of emperor fell vacant, and Francis was an unsuccessful candidate. He applied to his new ally of England to support him in this candidature, and Henry not only promised him all sorts of testimonials, but afterwards assured him, through Sir Thomas Boleyn, that, though his efforts had been unsuccessful, he had done all he could to help his election. Nevertheless, one of the French king's agents, being behind the tapestry when the Marquis of Brandenburg gave audience to Richard Pace, the English ambassador, distinctly overheard a speech from that diplomatist, urging that none but a German should have the imperial dignity. Francis was therefore quite well aware that Henry, for all his assurances, instead of trying to promote his election, had really used every effort to defeat it, the fact being that he was a double dealer in this matter, both to Francis and to his competitor Charles. For with less than his usual wisdom, Henry himself entered the field as a third candidate, and though he had at first advocated the claims of Charles, he afterwards did all he could for himself only. That Francis was indignant, as well he might be, at this perfidy, we know from the conversations he had with the Venetian ambassador, Justinian, on his return from England; but he thought it prudent to dissemble his real feelings and to profess much friendship. For various reasons, it seems that he could not afford to fall out with his brother of England. So the language of diplomacy between the two courts continued as sweet as honey, nor was the project of a meeting one whit the less genuinely entertained, because the professions of cordiality on both sides were empty wind. When it was deferred for a year, Sir Thomas Boleyn, who was ambassador at the French court, was instructed to tell Francis that the King of England had resolved to wear his beard till the interview should take place, as a proof of his desire for it. The response to this was a matter of course. Francis at once laid his hand upon his own beard and said, "Surely he would never put it off till he had seen the King of England." Alas for the promises of princes! These mutual pledges were given in August, and Henry had shaved by the following November. The fact was most unquestionably ominous, and it was not long before the shaving of King Henry VIII. Was known at the court of France, where it seems to have had a more depressing influence than any one cared to avow. Francis himself, indeed, does not appear to have taken any notice of it, but he betrayed some anxiety to learn news from Sir Thomas Boleyn, and when Sir Thomas replied that he had none, "By the faith of a gentleman," he said, laying his hand upon his bosom, "but for my confident expectation of this interview, I would at this moment have been at Milan." But Louise of Savoy, the French king's mother, ventured to speak more plainly, and to press the English ambassador for an explanation. She told him that she had been distinctly informed by Montpessat, a French nobleman who had just returned from England, where he had been kept as a hostage for the fulfilment of the last treaties, that the King of England had been shaving, and to ask if Boleyn knew what he meant by it. The ambassador's ingenuity seems to have been taxed for an excuse, but he managed tolerably well. "I said," he wrote to Wolsey, "that Montpezat had been with me at my lodging, and told me likewise, and further said that, as I supposed, it hath been by the Queen's desire, for I told my lady that I have hereaforetime known when the King's grace hath worn long his beard, that the Queen hath daily made him great instance, and desired him to put it off for her sake." French politeness could not but be satisfied with such an explanation. It was impossible to hold the King of England to his promise when the Queen wanted his chin smooth, and very likely the excuse offered was the true one, for there is no doubt at all that if Catherine of Aragon was not against the English beard movement, she was against the immediate cause of it, and did not greatly conceal her dislike to the proposed interview of Henry VIII. And Francis. Indeed, little more than 2 months before it actually took place, she had a conference about it with some of the English nobles who were strong against a French alliance, for Catherine was anxious that her husband should rather cultivate the friendship of her nephew Charles V., then newly made emperor, who also talked of a meeting with Henry, but a really cordial union with France would have prevented any cordiality with Charles. And in truth Henry's own wishes were not very different from hers. He too wished for an alliance with the emperor, only he wished the emperor to seek it of him. But the emperor's proposals for an interview with Henry were as cool as those of Francis were warm and eager. So, under the knowing policy of Wolsey, all encouragement was given to the French advances. Under these circumstances, however, Boleyn's answer to Madame Louise had just one fault. The excuse was a little too probable. Louise asked Boleyn, significantly, if the Queen of England were not Charles's aunt. "Madam," he replied, "he is her sister's son, but the King of England has greater affection for your son than for any king living." It was impossible to press the ambassador further. Madame expressed the greatest satisfaction, and said, "Their love is not in the beards, but in the hearts." But it was not there either. When Henry VIII. Appeared without a beard at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, the love was on his lips, and nowhere else. His lips were lying, while he told truth, with his chin. End of Henry VIII.'s Chin. Read by Bill Moseley, Llano County, Texas, USA.